folks, and welcome back. Bear Clan's Hiking Sedona podcast. Episode 11 today, folks, and we're going to get into classification of the terrain in Sedona. Why is it called a mountain versus a butte versus a hill? So we'll try and start logically from the bottom up, so to speak. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a hill. So hills are essentially like raised land that has sloping sides to it. They peak somewhere around maybe around 1,500 feet at the most, and a hill can never be considered a mountain, but a mountain can actually erode eventually down to being classified as a hill. A mesa, also known as a table. Mesas are elevated lands with a flat top and very steep rocks on the sides, and they are smaller than plateaus. There is a mesa here in Sedona called Horse Mesa in the village of Oak Creek that gives you a perfect example of a mesa. A bench is a term used for a mesa-like landform or structure that tends to be connected to a mountain or a mount, and it kind of juts out from the sides. Mountains may have many benches in order to get to the summit. So you may have 3 or 4 bench locations that you have to get to in order to get to the summit of the mountain. Plateaus are essentially very much like mesas, except they're insanely larger. So they're flat top lands that separate from their neighboring lands by insanely steep slopes, and they're mostly created by tectonic plate collisions or shifts. It's also created sometimes by things like lava flow. For us locals here in the Southwest, the Colorado Plateau is probably the most prominent plateau that we have in our area, and it's a real obvious one. You can even see the end of the Colorado Plateau while you're in Sedona, so it's pretty impressive. Cliffs are almost vertical formations of rock created mostly by plate shifting and major changes in the sea floors. So when water evaporated or washed away, cliffs were created from drastic drops from that land or the rock formations. Canyons are similar to valleys, but they are very deep, they're very narrow, and they tend to be surrounded by steep sides. Obviously, the most well-known is the Grand Canyon. If you've ever gone to the Grand Canyon, it meanders zigzagging all the way through, but all of the walls are incredibly steep, almost completely vertical. A valley is more like a low-lying area of land with gradual rises, not quite as aggressive as canyons. They're more on a gradual side, and these things tend to be mostly created by like waterways, rivers, or even some have been created through the glacial formations. Rocks, it's about the smallest thing we have, especially in Sedona. Rocks are kind of like small formations of sediment that were pretty solid, and they form shapes of almost like an abstract style. Mostly created through erosion of the seawater or sometimes left over from plate shifting. As it falls, it could shake and jar some of those cliff sides loose and create these really cool shapes. And Sedona's just filled with them. Buttes. Buttes are similar to mesas, but mesas are more flatter and probably not as pronounced. And the buttes are not going to always have a flat top. They tend to be a lot higher than they are wide, but it's also not that tall. You might confuse a rock with a butte as well. Buttes are just far larger than rocks. Now, mountains, here come the big boys. Mountains are fault creations, and these things rise from anywhere from about 1,000 to 2,000 feet in elevation, and they go up. Mountains tend to be flat-ish at the summits. They could have cascading or rolling hills on the summit, but they're essentially a flattish surface. Wilson Mountain, Munns Mountain, Secret Mountain, and Bear Mountain are actually true mountains that are located in Sedona. And Wilson actually has the highest summit, just around 7,122 feet of elevation. And that all depends on your GPS readings, of course. Mounts are rugged peaked and more massive than a mountain, and tend to have a higher elevation, well into the 20 and 30,000 foot range. We might know Mount Everest is probably the most famous mount in the world, and it measures a little bit over 29,000 feet tall. Now, in comparison, Mount McKinley here in the United States is only about 20,000 feet tall, and somewhere around number 100 of the top tallest mounts on the planet, so it's not even close to the top. Now, a peak is more of an aggressive summit, and it's got steeper angles of vertical kind of ascension. It goes up at a very alarming rate. Mountains and mounts can actually have peaks, but peaks can't have mountains or mounts. There's a place called Broad Peak located in Pakistan, and that's over 26,000 feet tall. In a comparison to that, Pikes Peak in Colorado is just over 14,000 feet. Mountain ranges are groupings of mountains together, forming very long areas and masses of summits, and can have mesas, benches, peaks, and hills throughout them. And you may end up getting many, many mountains inside the mountain range. A good example would be the Rocky Mountains. With that in mind, you might hear of a mount as part of a mountain range, like Mount Everest is part of the Himalayan mountains. You also might hear of a peak being part of a mountain range. Now, Pikes Peak, as I mentioned before, is part of the Rocky Mountain range. So it gives you an idea just how these structures are formed. And in Sedona, we have things from hills, rocks, mesas, buttes, mountains, but we don't have any mounts in Sedona. We are not that big. We're not that tall. All right, folks, thank you very much. That's it for that podcast. Nice, short, and sweet, but it gives you an idea as to the differences when you're hiking somewhere in the world, the differences between these categories of items. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. Stay tuned and listen to the next podcast coming up. And don't forget, subscribe to the podcast, like the podcast, put it as your favorites. That way you get notifications every time I create a new podcast. You'll have a notification of the latest podcast. Thank you again, folks. God bless you, and peace to you all.